if you're a recent graduate or the parent of one, you may have caught some headlines that Gen Z is entering the worst entry level job market in 37 years. 37? Like, how are they measuring that? How true is that? And is this just the latest tough turn through a perpetual cycle in American history for young people trying to find their first career job? Nick and Elise, thank you for being with us. Welcome to the Curiosity Desk.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
All right, Elise, I want to start with you. Okay, is this the worst job market in 37 years? And if so, how so?
Yeah, I'd have to say no. It is not the worst job market in 37 years. Certainly is the case that the unemployment rate has been ticking up over the last couple of years, and more so, certainly for young college grads, for young workers in general. When there's weakness overall, oftentimes young workers have it worse than other people. Just like other historically disadvantaged groups, they sometimes feel that pain more acutely. So it is not the worst. It has gotten worse over the last couple of years, but it is still, doing better than we were, let's say, coming out of the Great Recession.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a little bit. I wonder if you could take us into this a little bit more when we say it's worse. Like, I think about, if you're a musician and someone says that's a bad song, you might be like, that means nothing to me because I hear that song and I think the composition's good, but the playing's bad and the singing is beautiful, but the bridge is poor, right? As an economist, when you hear something like it's a tough job market or it's a bad job market, you must think that is meaningless. We need to get into the aspects of this. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. So can you take us into this particular sort of moment in time, this job market now, and talk about the aspects of this that you think are important and what are the good signs and the bad signs?
Yes, absolutely. So I think when we look at the overall job market, there's two indicators that people tend to look at. One is, what does job growth look like? And we're talking about payroll employment growth, so wage and salary workers. What does that look like? And we have seen a slowdown in job growth over the last year or two. Is that a problem on its own? Well, if you're approaching full employment where people are working, you might not see job growth. We also have net immigration slowing. So you don't need as many jobs because of policies of this administration. We don't have as many immigrants looking for jobs or working or even coming into this country. So that would change what you think of as good job growth. So it's been pretty decent, although it has slowed down. The unemployment rate is another key measure that has been ticking up, as I mentioned. And so that's one to keep an eye on. The one I prefer over both of those is the share of the population with a job, or the share of the population that you would think would be working, all else equal. So maybe those that are between the ages of 25 and 54, we tend to think of those as prime working age people. That has remained resilient. So that measure has not gone down, which I think is interesting. So it is still a pretty solid labor market. The measure that has the most weakness that I'm most concerned about in general and for young people in particular is the hires rate. And the hires rate has been falling over the last couple of years. The hires rate is pretty weak. You might almost say that it's depressed. People are sitting tight in jobs. They're not quitting and looking for better opportunities. And employers are sitting tight and not doing additional hiring. And that, I think, is the biggest culprit that has made it hard for young people to break into the labor market today.
Can we break young people into, two very broad categories, which is to say, is there anything that's particularly challenging about this particular market for college graduates in particular versus young people in general?
Well, when I look at both of them, you see weakness. You see the unemployment rate rising for those with a college degree. So I'm looking at 22 to 27-year-olds, those people that have just come out of college or are graduating now. You think about, what are their prospects? That unemployment rate has been rising, but also for people with less than a 4-year college degree. So who went to high school, maybe some college, maybe an associate's degree, their unemployment rate is also rising. So there doesn't seem to be anything particularly unique about college grads versus other young people who are getting hit with some weakness in the labor market today.
Is that a change historically, which is to say, I don't know, in 1965, there were presumably fewer college graduates, therefore probably more of a premium on having a college degree and therefore maybe a little bit more power in the job market versus 2026?
Yes, I think that you've hit the nail on the head. I think that when you think about power in the labor market, a college degree is losing its edge. It's losing its edge in terms of a sure thing to have a job and a sure thing to see better wages than they would have if they hadn't gotten that college degree. So the college wage premium has been faltering some over the last 2 decades, I would say. So that added advantage to having a college degree isn't as sure of a thing as it had been in the past. As the cost of college has been rising, that becomes an increasingly difficult proposition for many young people today.
Nick, we're going to bring in this conversation in just a second. Elise, one more question for you. We were just talking with Joan Donovan about AI, college graduates, and their reaction in some places to the rise of AI and the hype of AI. What do we know and not know about AI's impact on where things stand right now and all of the stuff that you were just talking about?
So it certainly is the case that young college graduates are more likely to work in what we would consider AI exposed occupations. So that's going to be true for young people with a college degree versus those without a 4-year degree. They're less likely to work in those what were considered AI exposed occupations. But what's interesting is that young college graduates are no more likely to work in those AI exposed occupations than other college graduates. So if you're older with a college degree, you have the same likelihood of being in these AI exposed occupations. So there's nothing unique about what is happening with those young college graduates. And I don't think the evidence has been compelling thus far that it has been causing job loss. I don't see that in the data. The occupations that many young people are in, predominantly in, have actually seen job growth over the last couple of years when we've seen an expansion of AI. So I'm not seeing it in the data. That doesn't mean that won't happen in the future. And that certainly doesn't mean that there isn't anecdotal evidence out there of many people struggling. I think that is absolutely the case. If you ever have an unemployment rate greater than 0, there are a lot of people out there who are looking for a job, and that is, that is real. And again, I think that depressed hires rate, it is it's no worse again in the industries where young people are more likely to work, that the hires rate has fallen for them, not even as much as it's fallen for, let's say, where non-college young people tend to work. And so I think that I'm not identifying AI as the culprit as much as I think this overall weakness that is making it very hard for them to break in.
All right, Nick, we're going to bring in here and try to get a little context on this particular weakness and put it in some historical context. When I started with Elise and said, is this the worst job market in 37 years? And she said, no, you had a face, which made me think you wholeheartedly agree. She mentioned the Great Recession in 2008. Maybe we start there. How is this moment like and unlike 2008?
That's a great question. And I think, part of that face is that's the job market into which I was seeking my first job.
I see. Yeah,
And so there's
I shouldn't have put
per-
words in your mouth. Go ahead. Yeah,
No,
clarify your
you're-
position.
But I think it's a recent analog, and it's an important one, because I think coming out of that recession, we saw a real divergence in the fortunes of college graduates, and particularly those who could, make a lot of money developing apps, and people who went to work on platforms that made employment increasingly precarious, increasingly unprotected, classified workers as independent contractors, and the rest. And so I see that divergence as a moment not unlike this one in some ways, because you have the rise of a kind of new organization of labor through technology, what we in labor studies call automation. But what, of course, is different about AI is that it does seem to threaten the livelihoods of people at elite places with degrees where they expected to go into, jobs that are exposed. As Elise said, they're the kind of spreadsheet heavy world of management consulting at the entry level, or iBanking, or these sorts of things. So I think there is a difference, but also I think in these moments of recession and then recovery, we often see a kind of diverging set of fortunes as new technologies and the ideologies of those who control them shape the new job market.
Okay. Well, let's take a look at some, if we're talking about, automation, changes in the way that we organize things, there are a couple of times in history that come to mind. One being, this seems to parallel it to a certain extent, or at least folks who are somewhat AI evangelists draw a comparison to, the rise of computers and what we all know now in retrospect was a dot-com bubble that burst. And so, as you look at this current moment, again, I sort of ask, and both of you, I'd be happy to have you weigh in on this. Can we talk about how this moment is or is not like that kind of .com burst in the late 90s, early 2000s, and what happened there?
Well, I might compare not just the burst, but the bubble that preceded it
Mm.
to this moment and to the 2008 recession as another case where you had really divergent fortunes. So, the 90s are often celebrated coming out of a kind of early 90s recession as a moment of growth, but it's very unequal. And NAFTA, and particularly the sort of opening of trade that follows, really devastates American manufacturing jobs. I mean, this is when we see real numbers of American jobs fall off a cliff, which is devastating, especially for rural areas, for people without college degrees in terms of their prospects. And that's happening at the same time that we see the first wave of a kind of a tech-driven economy emerging. And so while there is a lot of job loss in that dot-com bubble, there's also, I think, an emergent economy of haves and have-nots that sort of continued to grow. And I'd be curious to hear Elise talk about this, as I'm sure you have the numbers on that.
Right. I mean, I think that when we think about any kind of technological change, or we think about change in the economy, as you said, due to trade or other policy, we're interested in looking at what happens on average to the economy, but we're also looking at what happens to inequality. I think you really hit it on its head there. When who has the power and who is able to keep their jobs, and who are the capital owners that and who is where is that inequality going? And so for many typical workers, we've seen, and this isn't a new phenomenon over the last couple of years. In fact, we've seen some reduction of inequality over the last 10 years because the economy has been tighter. And that has meant that employers have had to work a little harder to attract and retain workers. We're seeing a little bit more weakness in the last year or two. And so some reversal of that. But for much of the last 5 decades, we have seen increasing inequality and more people at the very top amassing a larger and larger share of the economic pie. And so I think that power dynamic is really important when we think about the introduction of a new technology like AI. Well, who is going to have the power? Are workers going to be left behind again?
I wonder in this case, I think, and I'm sure this is not accurate or 100% true, but I think there is a notion, generally speaking, that if you look back through history, that the job losses or technological changes that like hurt workers, generally over time it hurts blue collar workers more than it hurts, I guess if you go way back, your landowners or whatever it is, or white collar. But in this case, it does seem like AI, to your point, it's college grads, it's more white collar workers that are maybe exposed to this disruption. And is that particularly different? And does that impact the way you find us all talking about this? Is that unique, or has it always been a mix?
Well, speaking historically, we could probably pull up examples that are, relevant to white collar positions being threatened in a number of cases. But I do think that in our recent past, this feels new. There's been a lot of discussion over the last decade in our politics of the divergent fortunes of non-college graduates and college graduates, and also how that's been regionalized, growing metros versus, people really suffering in places where industry has gone away. What I also think is interesting, though, thinking historically, is we should ask not just what is happening on the sort of technological or on the boss's side, but also what are workers doing about it? And so here I'd want to look to the organizing that's happening. And of course, we have some examples of highly skilled fields full of college graduates. I'm thinking of SAG-AFTRA, I'm thinking of the Writers Guild and the News Guild, where we have organizing that's really explicitly taken this on and tried to make sure that jobs and careers and creativity are protected. Now, how that applies to jobs that are not historically unionized, well, that's a question for organizing, but it's a political question as much as a technological question.
Interesting. When we talk about economic downturns, obviously the one that looms largest in our collective sort of memory, although, we didn't actually experience it, but, is the Great Depression. People think tough economic times, you think Great Depression. Is it as bad as that? Presumably the current situation right now, not as bad as the Great Depression, but are there lessons in looking at the Great Depression and what happened then for now? Is it a worthwhile exercise at all to look back to the Great Depression, Nick?
Well, I think of two things, and I can see Elise has thoughts too. First off, when we have this question about what's going to happen to young people in an unsteady economy, there's this question of automation we've been discussing. There's also the question of what we owe young people. We had our UMass Boston commencement today too. And I think about what our students are going off to do, opportunities they have. Obviously, in the 30s, in the New Deal era, we have a moment when the government steps in and creates jobs explicitly for young people in the case of, say, the National Youth Administration or the Civilian Conservation Corps. But if you take the WPA overall, 1 in 4 American households drew some wages from WPA programs over the 8 years of its existence. So that's a massive investment in people at a moment of uncertainty. But I would also point to the fact that in the 30s, the two of the major industries where we saw new organizing, CIO organizing, were industries that had seen tremendous automation in the previous decade, right? Automobiles and also electrical products. So we think of the GE workers up in Lynn or Wilmington or Everett in those years here in the Boston area. They organized in radically new ways. And those were young workers. And of course, they organized with the support of the federal government, right? And so I think it's important not just to think about what can we do for young workers, but also how can we support them as they organize to build the futures they want.
Elise?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think that we can go back. We can also just go back to the last recession, right? So the pandemic recession, we think about where do recessions come from? We think about oftentimes manufacturing job losses, construction, right? But there's like the traditional losses we think about. But what happened in the pandemic was different, right? It was leisure and hospitality jobs. People weren't going out to eat. They weren't traveling, retail jobs. And so that was very different. And that actually hit young people more as well, because many young people starting out are in those kinds of industries and those kinds of occupations that were hit worse. So what did we do, right? So we don't have to go back again to the Great Depression to think about the government stepping in, right? We reformed the unemployment insurance system. We actually made it affordable for people to keep putting food on the table and a roof over their head because we had enough of a safety net in place. Have we done anything to make a long-term fix? No, but we absolutely could. So we think about having a safety net if the economy goes sour. We need to make sure that we have those in place for people, not only people who have been employed and are losing their jobs, but young people who haven't gotten a foothold yet in the labor market. Some of those were left out initially in the pandemic recession of many of those measures. So I think there are fixes that we have already in the system that we could be reforming, that we could have in place that would help young workers, I think, disproportionately, but is actually a fix for the entire economy if things get worse.
All right. Well, so it sounds like, yes, things are tough out there, but also nothing we haven't seen before. We've been speaking with Nick Juravich and Elise Gould about the history and current state of the entry-level job market for young professionals. Thank you both for sharing your time and expertise with us on the Curiosity Desk today.
Thanks for having us.